The courthouse stood tall, its marble facade gleaming in the early morning light, casting a grand silhouette against the bustling city backdrop. The city itself, perched along the eastern coast, was a hub of power and influence, home to some of the most prestigious legal proceedings in the country. Inside, the air was always thick with a sense of formality, the kind that only comes when the stakes are high and the people who enter these halls are used to being seen and heard. The courtrooms, polished and pristine, were filled with well-dressed lawyers, business moguls, and high-ranking officials, people who had the resources to command attention and demand justice. But today, the usual hum of courtroom chatter seemed louder than ever. The buzz in the hallways wasn't about the cases that were about to unfold. It was about the presence of a new notable face in the courthouse. Jasmine Lee. She had been appointed to serve as the judge for one of the highest-profile cases in the city's history. A federal judge, black, poised, and incredibly accomplished, she had worked tirelessly for years to get to this position. She was a woman who had overcome countless obstacles to get where she was today, and yet the path had never been easy. Jasmine's journey had been one of grit and determination, always fighting to be seen, always fighting for the right to exist in a space where her voice mattered. Today, she was walking into that very space. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floor of the courthouse as she made her way toward the entrance. Dressed in her judicial robe, her expression unreadable, Jasmine held her head high, but there was a quiet tension in her chest. Today was important, and she knew it. But what she didn't know was that it was also going to be a day that would test everything she stood for, everything she had worked for. As she approached the security checkpoint, the first signs of tension began to unfold. Bobby Williams, a burly court officer with a reputation for his old-school methods and rigid demeanor, was stationed at the entrance. His job was simple: ensure everyone entering the courthouse did so properly. But when his gaze fell on Jasmine, he seemed to pause, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. There was no sign of recognition in his eyes. He didn't know who she was, and to him that was a problem. "Ma'am, you'll need to step aside," he said gruffly, blocking her path as she reached the metal detectors. Jasmine, composed as always, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm yet unwavering. Bobby gave her a once-over, from her carefully pulled-back hair to her immaculate judicial robe. He seemed unimpressed. "You can't just waltz in here like that," he muttered, his tone dismissive. "I'm Judge Lee," she responded, her voice smooth but firm. "I need to pass through to my courtroom." Without bothering to look at her credentials, Bobby motioned for her to step aside. Not without a proper check. Jasmine felt a flicker of frustration, but she remained calm. She produced her credentials, her badge shining in the light, but Bobby barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. The officer's actions were deliberate, almost as if he was asserting dominance over her. "Give that back," Jasmine said, her tone steely. But Bobby was undeterred. He continued to direct her towards a side room, one meant for secondary checks, ignoring her protests. "Standard procedure, sweetheart," he muttered, a sly grin creeping onto his face as he gestured for her to enter the small, dimly lit room. Inside, a cold air filled the space, and Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she didn't show it. The clippers sat on a table next to a chair in the center of the room, the sight of them unsettling. "Sit down," Bobby ordered, his voice a low growl. Jasmine didn't move. She knew what was happening, and she wasn't going to let it slide. "I don't consent to this," she stated, her voice as calm as the still air around them. But Bobby's expression hardened. "It's just procedure, Judge, nothing personal." He signaled to the other officers who came in, their presence looming. The moment they grabbed her wrist, Jasmine's heart sank, but she didn't resist. As the buzzing clippers neared her hair, her resolve hardened. What was happening wasn't about her. It was about a system, a broken system, trying to silence her. She wasn't going to let them win. Despite the humiliation, Jasmine stayed calm, her dignity intact. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't be intimidated. Little did Bobby and the other officers know that they had just laid hands on the wrong woman. She was no ordinary woman, no simple civilian. She was a federal judge, and today her quiet strength would rise. As the officers finished the invasive search, Jasmine stood tall, her composure unshaken. She simply took back her badge, nodded firmly, and walked out, ready for what was to come. The real battle had just begun, and this time she would take the bench and make them all face the truth. Jasmine stepped through the security checkpoint, the cold marble floors of the courthouse echoing under her heels. She was on a mission today, one that would require all the poise, authority, and confidence she had spent years cultivating. But today, something felt different. As she approached the metal detectors, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. She hadn't quite put her finger on it yet, but the air felt thicker, charged with an undercurrent of tension. As she moved closer to the security desk, Bobby Williams, a court officer with a reputation for his rigid and old-fashioned demeanor, glanced up from his post. His eyes locked on Jasmine, and for a moment she noticed the flicker of recognition, or rather, the lack of it. He didn't seem to see her as the esteemed judge she was. Instead, he scrutinized her like she was someone who didn't belong. His narrowed eyes conveyed an instant judgment. She wasn't one of them. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of line," Bobby said gruffly, crossing his thick arms over his chest. Jasmine paused, a flicker of annoyance running through her. She had been through countless security checks in this courthouse, always with respect. But this time felt different, and she could feel the familiar prickle of injustice rising within her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't hide the hint of caution. She wasn't sure why, but something about Bobby's demeanor made her uneasy. Bobby's gaze swept over her neatly pressed slacks, her tailored navy blue blazer, and her silver locks twisted neatly in a professional style. He clearly wasn't impressed. "You can't just walk into a federal building looking like that," he muttered under his breath, as if she was the one who didn't fit the mold. Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly. She didn't show her frustration, but a tightness settled in her chest. She had spent years earning respect, working her way through the ranks, and yet here she was being treated like any other civilian. "I'm Judge Lee," she said firmly, reaching into her blazer and producing her credentials. She handed it to him, but instead of acknowledging her title, Bobby merely glanced at the badge for a second before shoving it into his pocket without a word. Jasmine's patience began to wear thin, but she kept her composure. "I'd like that returned," she said evenly. Bobby stepped closer, his posture more intimidating now. "You in a rush, sweetheart?" he sneered, the word hanging in the air like an insult. Jasmine took a steadying breath. She knew better than to lose her cool in this moment. "I need to get to a courtroom," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Bobby snapped, his tone colder now. "That includes a random check." He motioned for her to move toward a side hallway, away from the main flow of people. Jasmine hesitated for only a second. She was aware of what was happening, the attempt to humiliate her, to remind her that despite her title, she was still seen as someone outside of the power structure. The arrogance of Bobby was palpable, and it irked her. But she didn't show it. Instead, she walked silently, her steps measured, her jaw clenched in determination. Inside the small, windowless room, the air was cold and still. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jasmine stepped in. There was a steel chair in the center of the room, a rolling cart with scanning equipment, and something that caught her eye, a pair of clippers, still and waiting. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She knew exactly what this was. She had heard of this type of intimidation before, but she never thought it would happen to her. Not in a federal courthouse, and not when she was here to do her job. "You're going to have a seat," Bobby said, his voice commanding. Jasmine stood firm, refusing to be bullied. "I don't consent to this," she said clearly, keeping her eyes locked on Bobby's. "You have no cause to detain me, and this is a violation of my rights." Bobby didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his face twisted with disdain. "That badge of yours doesn't mean anything here," he said, a sneer curling his lips. "Not to me." As if on cue, two other officers entered the room, their presence felt immediately. One grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the chair, while the other held the chair steady, readying the clippers. "This is not necessary," Jasmine said, her voice steady but rising now. "You are violating my rights, and I demand your names." She tried to stand, but one of the officers pushed her back down into the chair with a force she hadn't expected. The buzzing of the clippers filled the room. It sounded like an intrusion, a loud buzzing that felt like it was stripping away more than just her hair. It felt like a violation of everything she had fought for. Each strand of hair that fell to the ground was a reminder of the system she had worked so hard to be a part of. A system that was now doing its best to strip her of her dignity. The officers laughed, one of them muttering, "She looks better already." The coldness of the moment took over, but Jasmine remained unflinching. She didn't show anger, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside, though, something was growing. Something deeper than humiliation. It was purpose. As the clippers stopped, Jasmine's heart pounded, but her face remained impassive. Her scalp felt exposed, vulnerable, but she wouldn't let them see how much this hurt. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten to her. Bobby gestured toward the door. "You're free to go. Courtroom's that way." Jasmine stood, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't let it show. She didn't ask for her credentials back. She took them from his desk without a word, then walked out of the room. Her mind was racing now. The feeling of injustice, the rage that had been building, was hard to ignore. She had been violated, but she had no intention of letting this moment define her. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not today. The courtroom awaited. And Jasmine Lee was ready to take her seat, as the person they never expected. Jasmine stood outside the door to Bobby's office, her hand clutching a USB drive that contained everything she needed. The video, the truth, every second of what had transpired, every humiliating, degrading moment was right there. She had watched it again and again in her office, the raw footage replaying in her mind as it fueled the fire inside her. She wouldn't let this go. Not now. Not ever. She had spent years earning her position, fighting to be seen as an equal in a world that constantly tried to remind her she didn't belong. This courthouse, these very walls, were supposed to represent justice. And yet, she had been humiliated, stripped of her dignity, by someone who thought her mere presence could be dismissed. But Jasmine was done with silence. She wasn't just a judge, she was a force of law. And today, she was going to make sure that the law didn't just protect the powerful, it protected everyone. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine opened the door. Bobby was seated at his desk, his back turned as he typed on his computer. The moment he heard the door creak open, he turned sharply, his face faltering when he saw Jasmine standing there, holding the USB drive. His eyes widened in panic. "Judge Lee?" Bobby stammered, his voice faltering. He stood up quickly, trying to mask the nervous energy in his posture. "What can I do for you today?" Jasmine didn't say anything right away. She walked into the office with the same poise she always carried. But this time, it felt different. Her every step echoed authority. She wasn't just walking to do her job, she was walking to demand justice. With a smooth motion, she set the USB drive down on his desk. Bobby's eyes darted nervously from the drive to her face, his lips pressed tightly together. He knew what she was about to show him. "I have something to show you, Bobby," Jasmine said, her voice calm, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "I think you know exactly what's on this." Bobby's expression shifted from concern to something almost defensive, as if he wanted to shrug it off. I don't know what you're talking about, Judge," he said, forcing a laugh that was too quick to be genuine. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, watching him fidget. She wasn't buying it. She had seen men like Bobby before, men who thought their positions allowed them to act with impunity, men who thought the badge they wore gave them the right to treat others however they saw fit. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. "Really?" she asked, her voice growing firmer. "Because this," she pointed to the USB drive, "this says otherwise." She reached for the drive and slid it into his computer without waiting for him to respond. The video popped up on the screen almost instantly. Bobby's face drained of color as the footage started to play, showing the exact moment Jasmine had been forced into that sterile, isolated room. The sound of the clippers buzzed in the air, her scalp being shaved, his laughter echoing in the background. The way he handled her with disdain, as though she was just another victim to be tossed aside. Jasmine could see Bobby's face growing red as the video played. His mouth opened slightly, then shut, as he searched for something to say. But there was nothing. The footage spoke for itself. It was clear, it was damning, and it was undeniable. "You're right, Bobby," Jasmine said, her voice now cold and sharp. "This isn't a misunderstanding, this is abuse. This is what happens when someone in power thinks they can humiliate others without consequence." Bobby shifted uneasily in his chair, his hands fumbling at his desk. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His entire posture had changed, from defensive to guilty, as the reality of his actions sank in. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, keeping her eyes locked on him. "How many others have you done this to, Bobby?" she asked quietly, her gaze unwavering. "How many others have walked through those doors, just like me, only to be treated like nothing more than an inconvenience? How many people have you humiliated, and how many times have you done this without anyone calling you out?" Bobby's eyes darted to the door, as if looking for some escape, but the room felt suffocating now. There was nowhere to hide. "I didn't know who you were," Bobby muttered, his voice shaky. "I thought you were just another black woman trying to get through security. I didn't think you were." His voice trailed off, realizing just how badly he had messed up. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard enough of that excuse before. It wasn't about who she was. It was about how he treated her, how he saw her, and how he thought he could get away with it. "You didn't think," Jasmine said coldly. "You never thought that the woman you were about to humiliate had more power than you could imagine. You never thought that I'd be the one standing here, holding you accountable for your actions. But now you're going to face the consequences, Bobby. You've humiliated me, and I'm not going to let it slide. Not now, not ever." Bobby opened his mouth, but again, no sound came out. Jasmine was a force of law, an authority he could no longer dismiss. The trembling in his hands and the panic in his eyes made that clear. "I'm going to the authorities," Jasmine continued, her voice low and controlled. "You will face the investigation you deserve. This is not going to be swept under the rug." She stood up, her chair scraping back sharply, the finality of her movement clear. As she turned to leave, she shot him one last glance over her shoulder. "Don't even think about trying to hide behind the system, Bobby. The truth is already out, and you're not going to run from it." The door shut behind her, leaving Bobby alone in his office, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. He had crossed the line, and now there would be no escaping the reckoning that was coming for him. Jasmine's steps echoed in the hallway as she walked away. She had been humiliated. She had been violated. But she was not defeated. Not now, and not ever. The battle for justice was just beginning, and Jasmine Lee was ready to see it through to the end. After confronting Bobby and forcing him to acknowledge his wrongdoing, Jasmine knew this battle was far from over. She couldn't let it go. The injustice she had faced needed to be exposed, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly in silence. Her next step was clear. She had to make sure the truth came to light. Jasmine swiftly passed the video footage to the appropriate authorities, taking her role as a judge to a new level of responsibility. She worked with the right legal channels to ensure the incident was fully investigated, knowing that the system often overlooked such cases when they involved someone in power. Bobby's actions, though seemingly trivial to him, had violated a fundamental law: respect, decency, and equality. Jasmine knew this couldn't be swept under the rug. The news spread like wildfire. The footage of Bobby humiliating her went viral, and soon the media picked up on the story. Outrage simmered among the public, and Jasmine became the face of a larger movement. People rallied behind her, and social media exploded with support. Her bravery in exposing the truth resonated with countless others who had suffered at the hands of discriminatory practices, but never had the courage to stand up. The public outcry grew louder as people began to demand accountability for Bobby's actions. The investigation into Bobby's behavior began almost immediately. His actions were now part of a broader conversation on systemic racism, and he was officially placed under scrutiny. He faced not only an internal investigation, but also potential criminal charges for abuse of power, and rightfully so. The video, once a symbol of degradation, had transformed into a weapon of justice, and Jasmine had wielded it with unflinching resolve. As for Jasmine, she became something more than just a judge. She was now a symbol of persistence, integrity, and the fight for justice. Her calm, composed approach had revealed the flaws in a system that was supposed to serve everyone equally. Jasmine's courage became an inspiration for those who had been wronged, but too afraid to speak up. She was no longer just a public servant, she was a public champion for justice. Days later, as the news of Bobby's investigation made headlines, Jasmine returned to the courtroom. The weight of her actions had changed her. She walked with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that she had stood firm when the system tried to silence her. When she took her place on the bench, she did so with even more conviction than before. She had fought for herself and for justice. Now, every decision she made carried the strength of someone who had seen injustice firsthand and refused to let it go unchallenged. Bobby, on the other hand, was subjected to a thorough investigation. His career, once full of arrogance and unchecked authority, now hung in the balance. Public opinion had shifted drastically, and the once untouchable officer was now being held accountable for his actions. His fate was sealed as he faced the legal consequences of his cruelty. The truth, Jasmine realized, wasn't always immediate. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it whispered through the cracks of an unjust system and waited for someone to listen. That's exactly what Jasmine did. She listened, she acted, and now justice had been served. As the story came to a close, Jasmine's legacy was no longer just one of law and order. It was one of hope and change. Her quiet strength, unwavering in the face of adversity, had made all the difference. This story reminds us that while injustice may seem overwhelming, standing up for the truth can change everything. Jasmine Lee showed that no matter who we are or what we face, if we believe in justice and fight for what is right, the truth will always prevail. If you believe in the power of justice and the importance of standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's continue to spread stories of courage, change, and the fight for justice, because every voice matters.